of the story behind William Branham, in 1924, there's some other history that is going to converge and basically become a key element of William Branham's personal makeup. In 1924, you've got Bosworth, who's touring in these healing revivals that are widely popular. In 1924, the Klan in Indiana is growing to its supreme height of popularity. And in May of 1924, D.C. Stevenson at the Cadle Tabernacle, where William Branham and Jim Jones held their revivals. Cadle was the Klan headquarters in 1920.
You heard that correct. Branham and Jim Jones held their revivals there. Jim Jones' origins are from this Pentecostal movement as well. And let's not forget that F.F. Bosworth, who was the founder of the Assemblies of God, was beat down by the kukluxklan, who considered themselves a religious organization. You have to remember, the birth of a nation came forth in 1912. These were really heated racial times, and we know who funded the birth of a nation. It was the Khazarian Khazar Jews who funded that movie, owned MGM Studios, started the KKK, and also purchased the garments for all the members of the KKK and passed them around. So they were hiding, as Khazarians do, and masquerading themselves as Caucasian, white folks, so-called rednecks, to start this movement because they were vehement about that black man ever waking up again. Let him have his Pentecostal Church of God in Christ Christian Church, as long as he never says he is a part of the 12 tribes of Israel.
24. D.C. Stevenson says, God help the man who issues a proclamation of war against the Klan in Indiana now. We are going to klux Indiana as she has never been kluxed before. I'll appeal to the ministers of Indiana and do the praying for the Ku Klux Klan, and I'll do the scrapping for it. And the fiery cross is going to burn at every crossroads in Indiana as long as there's a white man left in the state. So this is 1924. D.C. Stevenson, who's the most powerful Klan figure in the nation, in the largest Klan organization in the nation, in the home of G.T. Haywood, who is a black Pentecostal minister, well respected in Pentecostal circles as one of the key figures who led the charge for oneness Pentecostalism. And Haywood had published a tract called The Victim of the Flaming Sword, which somebody has sent us a copy of, and I'll put the copy up.
They didn't want Haywood at their revival, so they threatened to lynch him after one of the church services.
Up in the video version of this podcast. And 1924, the same time that book was published that you held up, the Knights of the Flaming Sword, which was formed by William Joseph Simmons, the head of the original Ku Klux Klan. Roy Davis was his second in command. Davis helps form this, and they joined together. And the reason this is important to the Bosworth story is that when they came into Jeffersonville, Indiana to hold their initial revivals that would literally create William Branham's first church, they held it with Ralph Rader, who was a very close family member to Paul Rader, who was in the Christian Missionary Alliance that Bosworth was also preaching through. So you've got all this web of connections from not only the white supremacy groups to the religious foundations to the organizations to the to the Klan and the Klan headquarters. That's May of 1924 that D.C. Stevenson makes this announcement. And then we have, they had to have organized this and prepped for it. So the organization of Bosworth to come to Klan headquarters would have been shortly after he makes this announcement that they're going to bring religion into helping the Klan survive. They had contracted with Bosworth to hold an entire 2 months of revivals at Klan headquarters. And Bosworth comes to the Cadle Tabernacle, and he's preaching sermons with titles like How the Church May Be Avenged of Her Adversary, right after D.C. Stevenson.
The adversary was the black man in the Christian church in the early Pentecostal movements. And I wanted to throw this in as a side note. There was a group of people and doctors that followed behind every so-called healing at these Pentecostal revivals, and most of the people who claimed to be healed because they had to speak faith, they all died within 3 weeks. Let's continue.
And had made this announcement. Now, again, we can't say that Bosworth was in the Klan, but he was a recognized member of one of the predominantly white denominations of faith, coming to the Klan headquarters for an entire 2 months of revivals.
Yeah, I kind of go back and forth because, if I put it on a scale, right? So, he's, in some articles, he's been beaten by white supremacists, right, for having interracial revivals.
Because you want to worship him.
Obviously, at a point in time, he is not in favor. The Klan doesn't like him. Obviously, they took him out and beat him. Silly.
Yeah.
But then you come about 10 years down the road, and when he comes to Indiana, for example, instead of having revivals with G.T. Haywood, right, and the other prominent people like that, the people of color that are in Pentecostalism in Indiana, he chooses to have his revival at Cadle Tabernacle, which is the headquarters of the Ku Klux Klan. So, if nothing else, it kind of makes a statement that this is the side of the aisle I'm choosing to be on, right? So I think there is at least a statement in that Bosworth is acknowledging I don't want to get beat again, maybe. I don't know exactly where you put it, but he's definitely, for whatever reason, siding with the white supremacist segregation opinions that he needs to stay away from more of the black Pentecostals. Unfortunately, that does seem to be the direction that he took. And then as far as, the connection back, you're right, there is an interesting connection between Bosworth and Roy Davis, and that connection is through the Rader brothers, John. The Rader brothers did indeed tour with Bosworth during his healing revivals as part of the Missionary Alliance. We can find newspaper articles of them holding meetings together. And then when Roy Davis comes to Indiana, it is Ralph Rader who does really help stir his initial popularity in Jeffersonville when he makes his entrance into Indiana. So that's really interesting stuff.
Another interesting side fact, Roy Davis's denomination of faith that he created was like this big magnet that attracted everything from nails to razor blades. And it was called the Pentecostal Baptist Church of God sect. In other words, I'm going to try to attract the Pentecostals. I'm going to try to attract the Baptists, the Church of God. Well, William Branham also calls this the Missionary Baptist. And we've got the Missionary Alliance, and we got we have Davis clearly holding revivals with people involved in the Missionary Alliance Church. Well, that was called, at some point in time, it was called the Missionary Baptist. We don't have much information because most of that history has been completely erased from time. But it appears as though there was some sort of attempt, at least, to try to bring the Christianary Mission Alliance together with Roy Davis's Pentecostal sect.
Yeah, and I think for me, again, there's so much of this is subjective. My thought is if Bosworth was working with the white supremacists, during the 20s, it was probably, seems to me, it would be as a result of coercion or intimidation more than anything, most likely. That's kind of my opinion at the moment on why Bosworth might be doing these things.
Yeah, my opinion, I don't see Bosworth as a white supremacist by no means. And I don't even see him promoting white supremacy ideas other than some of the foundational elements such as British Israelism. I see Bosworth as this somewhat innocent bystander.
You're trying to give this man a pass when you know that association brings on assimilation. And he had to associate with the Ku Klux Klan people to not be beaten or killed again. He had an opportunity on many occasions he didn't have to go and preach at a Ku Klux Klan church that was used for their rallies. He had options to go and preach elsewhere. He made it clear what his side was going to be. But I just want you to see how the Ku Klux Klan was heavily involved in the Christian Pentecostal church in the 1900s. I know for a fact that the latter rain movement of the Halton brothers that were here in California, some of their children were founders of the Hells Angels of Northern California. You can't make this stuff up. They didn't want y'all around, and now y'all holding on to the Pentecostal Christian Church for dear life. So I'm just playing this little documentary because they have good information, but they're going to look out for their own because they've been influenced by their forefathers of this ministry. They realize that they came up in this garbage, and they're trying to make sense of it now. Like, was everything I was born as a child a lie? Yeah, it was. And now they don't know what to do, what to worship, how to worship.
They got brutally beaten, and then something happens, and he's either using the protection of the white supremacists not to get beaten again, or he has become favorable to the idea that white supremacy can coexist in this Pentecostal world. So it's way more complicated than we can probably even explain in this episode. But I don't see Bosworth as being a racist either. It's just he is heavily influenced by racism, if I can say it like that.
Right. And so we have a pretty good idea overall, though, of Bosworth's views from his books and then from his history and his influences. He was influenced by Kenyon. He was influenced by Dowie. He was influenced by Parham. And so he also actually spent some time working with John Lake as well. Bosworth did. You'll find that as you read through some different sources. So we really have a solid idea of where Bosworth's ideas and beliefs came from and who they were shaped by. And so he is an important conduit through which all of these ideas flow into the healing revivals as time comes. And he's also an important conduit for British Israel ideas to flow in. And John, I don't know if you know this, but there's a minister named Russell Kelso Carter. He was a holiness minister in the late 1800s who worked with A.B. Simpson and some other figures back then. He seems, from my research, seems to be one of the very first people to actually preach positive confession. So, positive confession and these ideas even go back beyond Kenyon. And very interestingly, Russell Kelso Carter was also a British Israelite, and he also seems to be the figure that introduced what we would call serpent seed into British Israelism as well. So, there's a conduit through which all of these ideas can flow through Bosworth down to...
Positive confession is what you know as word of faith today, and also manifest destiny that you hear a lot of today. This stuff started in the early Caucasian Pentecostal Christian Holy Ghost filled church. And let me continue, let you hear more.
To William Branham. And some of these ideas we have documentation that Bosworth did believe them, did adhere to them, and then others we can only just kind of speculate whether Bosworth believed them or not. But he was certainly around people who believed those things.
There are a lot of people who try to disconnect William Branham from the Word of Faith movement because Branham literally put such a black eye in American religion that everybody who's built these ministries, they try to separate from William Branham. But if you really take a step back and you look at what was introduced through these revivals, and in this case introduced to William Branham through F.F. Bosworth from John Alexander Dowie, it's like you've got this hill of snow and you're just dropping all of these marbles on the hill. And as they roll, they collect more snow, they grow, they become these massive, massive snowballs going down the hill. Well, these snowballs are these different movements within Christianity that emerge in the Word of Faith movement, the Kansas City Prophets.
Right.
You've literally all of these connections to William Branham's ministry would not exist without William Branham. And Kenneth Hagin, who is deeply involved with William Branham's early ministry, he's part of the revivals. He's in the Voice of Healing magazine.
Yep.
They emerge based on this platform that William Branham has introduced into mainstream through the teachings of Bosworth that were the teachings of John Alexander Dowie.
Yeah, and in our next episode, we're going to explore these divine healing beliefs and the Word of Faith healing beliefs even more, and so and eventually we'll do a full episode on
Kenneth Hagin, Oral Roberts, Jimmy Swaggart. You remember the 80s and 90s TBN. Just go through the list of TBN. It goes all the way down up to Parsley, to all these different people. These were their forefathers that taught them all of this. All this showmanship. Let me play some more.
on serpent seed and Christian identity theology too. And something very interesting in my sect of the message, John, is we did not believe positive confession or divine healing in our sect of the message the way that William Branham and F.F. Bosworth taught it. Somewhere along the way, we abandoned their teaching. So that to me is incredibly interesting that we dropped that from our beliefs. But essentially we took a kind of a high view of God's sovereignty in healing, and we gradually had drifted back into a more Baptist way of looking at divine healing over the years in our sect of the message. But I'm not really sure how true that is for the rest of the message. My take is that the rest of the message held pretty closely to the original divine healing and word of faith and positive confession beliefs of Bosworth. So I'm really interested to look and explore that a little more in the next episode.
Yeah, I would say if you look at Word of Faith, you see strong elements of the Manifest Sons of God doctrine. They are completely separate movements, don't get me wrong, but there are elements of Manifest Sons of God in the Word of Faith movement. And I would say the main sect went more towards the Manifest Sons of God theology that William Branham taught, and Word of Faith emerged from it, using parts of it as a foundation. So you've got the two movements that are separate, but the main sect was definitely more on the Manifest Sons of God side.
That makes sense, and the same with us. We went more down the Manifested Sons of God route too, rather than the Word of Faith route. In our next episode, I look forward to kind of getting into the nuances of that. So kind of coming back to Bosworth's story, he was a prominent touring evangelist up until 1934, and then in 1934 something unusual happens. Bosworth just kind of disappears.
Yes.
He just kind of drops off the face of the earth for about 10 years, and there's very little information about what happened for this 10-year period that he disappeared. But what we can tell, the little hints in the sources are that the Christian Missionary Alliance started to reject British Israelism in that time frame, and AOG and other groups are also starting to reject British Israelism. So British Israelism had originally came into Pentecostalism from the early days. Parham himself was one. But there's this move to start moving away from British Israelism in this time frame. And as that happens, Bosworth kind of gets on the outs of these groups. And he's still very committed to British Israel ideas. And so the alliance kind of forces him out of their group because he wouldn't give up British Israelism. That seems to be, from the best that I can tell, the catalyst behind his disappearance. And so there's just a little tiny bit we know about that period of time, but it seems like Bosworth is very committed to his British Israel beliefs, and that's the main catalyst for his disappearance and whatever is going on in these 10 years that he's off the radar.
And he would have to be, right, because his doctrinal foundation was the doctrinal foundation of John Dowie, and Dowie's entire premise at the point of time in which Bosworth joined into the Dowie sect was British Israelism. So if you take away that, you've literally taken away Bosworth's entire foundation. So there's no way he's going to give it up. He's going to instead try to find a means to re-inject British Israelism into mainstream, which he apparently does through William Branham.
Right, and today, there is very few groups.
So Branham was into British Israelism. Branham believed he was one of the original 10 tribes, based upon one of the 10 tribes of Israel.
Out there that embrace British Israelism. It is pretty well a dead ideology. But it's hard to understate how important this was back in these days. This was in early Pentecostalism, in these, and not just Pentecostalism, this view was held in multiple denominations at the time. This was a quite important viewpoint, British Israelism. Not so much that it changed the world or anything like that, but the ideas that formed around British Israelism, those ideas still exist today. There are ideas birthed out of British Israelism that are still here today, but the core British Israel ideas have more or less died, and they start dying in the 1930s and 1940s.
Right in time for the narrative to change, where the church would begin to support the nation state of Israel and tell Christians we must support them, and that whatever you do against them, God will judge you. If you bless Israel, you'll be blessed. If you curse Israel, you'll be cursed, because the narrative was changing. And you begin to have people like John Hagee telling his church that we got to give our money to that nation state of Israel, because the dynamics of the government of the United States was changing to support this nation state. That's all in the news right now. Don't you see the timing and the politics behind this whole thing? And then at the same time, you had a sect of the Christian church that started preaching replacement theology. There's no more Israel. The church has replaced Israel. Replacement theology. And let's not forget, not only were they early kukluxklan, but they were also Freemasons at the head of every various religion in the United States that all of our people want to be a part of and refuse to leave. These people are demonic at the core, because they're trying to find a God and don't want to serve our God. They're envious of the creator, God of the Hebrews. So they create these false gods. This is a fascinating time to have all this information at our hands, fingertips, books you can read to find out the origins, so you can have firsthand scholarship, firsthand accounts of historical evidence of things altering, switching, and changing. Let's listen to, there's a few more minutes left.
But traces of that still continue on into the message and into Pentecostalism and evangelical Christianity as a whole. Some of the ideas, especially a lot of the interest and focus on Israel, and some of the views on end time prophecies related to Israel, those viewpoints developed within British Israelism because of British Israelism, and they survived the death of the British Israel ideology and kind of got adopted into other belief sets carried down to the present day. So that's something very interesting to me, because like I've mentioned, John, I am so interested. I have tried to figure out where in the world did the stuff we believe in the message came from, after I realized God hadn't sent it to William Branham by an angel. And so I have dug and dug and dug, and I believe, very well traced a lot of definitely a lot of our focus on Israel ideas back to concepts that developed in British Israelism in the 1800s.
Yeah. The message cult's argument for this is, well, it was divinely inspired, and William Branham, yes, he learned it from other men, but it was a movement by God to introduce it to the nation. Well, that's okay if they're good ideas, right? But some of these are just so grossly incorrect that there's no way that God would by any means try to further white supremacy or the foundational platforms that are pseudo-archaeology and completely incorrect.
Yeah, so there's definitely, to me, British Israelism is a very interesting subject, and there is actually precious little scholarly research into British Israelism. And I don't know, we still might do a full episode on British Israelism at some point, but there is lots of very interesting things here that do become very impactful in later years after British Israelism itself kind of fully dies. So, but yeah. Anyway, whatever the case, Bosworth's flying under the radar. We don't really know exactly what he's doing during these years. There is a little bit of time we know he's doing a radio program in Chicago in the mid 30s, but that's really the only thing we know that he was really doing in this time for sure, was that he was doing a little radio preaching. And so whatever the case, he kind of stays disappeared until about the same time that William Branham starts to rise in popularity. And it's 1944, 1945 that Bosworth reappears on the scene. And right at the same time, William Branham's becoming popular. And so how exactly that he comes into contact with William Branham is, to me, slightly mysterious, John. There's something about the story that don't quite ring true to me, I guess, when I read it. And when we read the official accounts in A Man Sent from God, there's actually elements in this story that we can prove are not true about the circumstances around William Branham meeting F.F. Bosworth. So I really believe there's more to the story than we're told. I think that's a fair assessment.
I do too. There's no way that William Branham didn't know of Bosworth being, holding revivals with Davis and Caleb Ridley, the Klan, the white supremacy. It's not that Bosworth was in the white supremacy, but they were revivalists at a time whenever Bosworth was the most famous revivalist in the nation. Upshaw was quite honestly the second most famous, Congressman William D. Upshaw, who's working with Davis. 1944-45, whenever Bosworth reemerges, is when you find Congressman Upshaw and Roy Davis being involved in the scandal in California where they're starting to build the third wave of the Ku Klux Klan. And then, there's no way that William Branham didn't know of Bosworth. When Bosworth is in Chicago and he's doing these radio broadcasts and he's deeply involved with, Ralph Rader, we have William Branham going to Chicago likely with Davis, we don't know, but to Chicago to the World's Fair to see Rader.
Right, and let me read the story in here, John, just a paragraph or so of when William Branham meets F.F. Bosworth. And let me read that. To me, this is this is just really interestingly worded even. So let me read this to you. It says, January 1948, this is from A Man Sent from God. January 1948 found us leaving our frozen homeland for a southward pilgrimage to the winter paradise of Miami, Florida. However, our motive was not a winter vacation, as was that of the convulsive mobs who soaked their money in the horse races, dog races, beach extravagance, and general sinful revelry. So they had a high view of Florida. He says, but we went to minister to the needy population, even in that beautiful nature of Eden. And so he goes on here and say, not all, of course, were there for those sinful activities, but many of them went away whole. Here it was our privilege to meet Avok Hagopian, a young Christian Arminian who had been anointed in his native country with a similar experience to that of Brother Branham. Heaven smiled on us that night during the campaign when we were also privileged to meet F.F. Bosworth, a veteran of the healing ministry in the earlier days. So William Branham, according to Man Sent from God, he meets F.F. Bosworth at this meeting in Florida at the exact same time he meets Avok Hagopian in January 1948. And what is kind of interesting there is, again, we know that's actually not true. William Branham certainly we know he had met Avok Hagopian at least the year earlier and had actually already had meetings with him then. So it kind of, the way that's all packaged together there, it kind of gives the hint that there's more to this story than they're telling us. Probably somebody has arranged all of this. Someone has definitely arranged William Branham coming into contact with F.F. Bosworth and Avok Hagopian. This wasn't a chance meeting. Somebody has put this together.
Yeah, and if you really think about it, these revivals were show business. Back before the movie industry today is this powerful freight train that until COVID crippled the movie theaters, it was literally unstoppable. Well, back then, the revivals were so unstoppable. And we have evidence that the Kardashian family are the ones who sponsored Avok Hagopian. And
an Armenian who supposedly became a spirit-filled Christian was backed and sent to the United States by the Kardashian family. Folks, you may have probably seen the documentary. You need to do your research on the Kardashian family, a band of gypsies. But there's a curse over them that they would be famous for no reason. And as you can see, they're heavily spoke of. They're heavy part of the entertainment industry and have been for no reason at all. But now you're starting to see the tentacles of this Kardashian family and how they influenced Branham, Hagobian from Armenia, and F.F. Bosworth. They all met. You know why they all met? Because of what this gentleman just said. Revival meetings in the 40s was big business. It was pretty much entertainment. It was entertainment. American public would go out to see this spectacle. They would go to see this stuff. Let me play the rest. I can't even believe the Kardashians popped up with William Branham in the same sentence. I can't even, I'm scratching my head right now.
William Branham mentions the same people that brought Avoc down. They asked me to go to a place. So the Kardashian family are also working with William Branham. And Tatos Kardashian's nephew, I believe it was Dima Shakarian, who worked with William Branham for almost the rest of William Branham's revival touring career. So all of these people are pulling the strings, so to speak, of Branham and Avoc and possibly Bosworth. And we have a photograph of William Branham who is meeting with Avoc Hagopian for the first time, allegedly for the first time. But they're all converging.
False prophets like Benny Hinn. Benny Hinn is attached to these people too. So now we know that the Kardashians and them, everybody got into this for money. These people were making millions of dollars back in these days, which was a lot of money. It was showmanship.
Literally because the Kardashian family are setting this up. And the question that forms for me, was this being set up as a new business opportunity for entertainment, or was it really just religion, and were they just really focused on religion? I have to weigh in the balance of the scales who we're talking about. This is the Kardashian family.
Right, and for me, just to keep it all in context, the Kardashian family, their elder members of their family, they were at the Azusa Street revival too, right? So
Right.
they would have personally known Bosworth. Okay, so you know kind of connect those things together. They would have personally have met and known Bosworth, and they themselves were deeply involved in Pentecostalism from the very beginning. So they have a religious aspect to be interested in it as well. And then the other aspect of it is,
Who would have thought the Kardashians with a Pentecostal revivalist background? Maybe that's why they all marrying brothers. I don't know.
that take these men in the Kardashian family and connected to the Kardashian family, these are actually the same men who are going to form the Full Gospel Businessmen a few years down the road from this. So it is the men who are going to become the main financiers of William Branham's campaign in later years as the Full Gospel Businessmen that are definitely sending Avoc Hagopian down to this meeting in 1948, and they also knew F.F. Bosworth as well, so, it's entirely reasonable for us to conclude that they may possibly have also suggested that Bosworth, come to the meeting as well, or even paid him to go there. And a second thing that may have possibly brought it about, which I don't think we've, really directly mentioned this yet, but in a real clear way, but Gordon Lindsay grew up in Zion, Illinois, too, with his family. And it's entirely likely that they were, him and his family, who are also British Israelites, who'd also come out of Zion, had been acquainted with F.F. Bosworth, too. And it's entirely possible that it's through Gordon Lindsay that F.F. Bosworth gets invited in to join. And, it's not exactly clear how it happens, but somehow or another, someone is bringing all of these people together, and someone also has to be paying for all of this, right? Because these things don't happen for free.
Yeah, there's definitely more to the story than we're getting from this. And there's, Gordon Lindsay was a speaker who held conferences talking about British Israelism. So he's definitely involved in spreading this notion. So he's all.
And his, I think it was his brother Hal Lindsey, who do the false prophecies about Gog and Magog war, which has nothing to do with Armageddon. That's something after the millennial reign. The more I look back, Pentecostalism, the Christian church, the different sects and denominations, it's all lies. And it's amazing that they're talking about British Israelism in the 1800s while we were still slaves, knowing they had the records of who we were. And so right before any awakening could happen, we're steeped deep into this Pentecostalism, and they're wearing this so-called badge. This is why they're acting that way right now, because they figure you're going through a British Israelism fad. Now you're African Israelism. And so not understanding yours is part of a major awakening prophesied in the Bible. Can these dry bones live again? And they tried to hijack it, and it had to be abandoned. And then we see everything that's going on in the world. But that's prophetic in a whole nother aspect. Let's finish this out.
Also, again, deeply influenced by Dowie. So these guys are literally trying to rebuild the empire that Dowie himself had built that had crumbled. And William Branham is the new, basically the new Dowie, if you want to look at it this way. And we even have a photograph, Charles is holding it up here, of the men standing around the tomb of Dowie. So these are definitely men who are proclaiming the Dowie doctrine. And even in the Voice of Healing, they're going through the new religion as they're creating it, but they're advertising John Dowie in this new religion that they're forming.
Right. Dowie is treated as a hero by these men. Gordon Lindsay has very good write-ups on Dowie in his magazine. Gordon Lindsay and F.F. Bosworth end up taking William Branham to Zion, and he kind of gets a hero's welcome almost when he comes back to Zion. The sons of Zion return, F.F. Bosworth and Gordon Lindsay, and they've brought a new Elijah with them.
Right.
Yeah. It's the first that I've been able to identify the notion of passing the mantle, because William Branham goes to Zion and he says, John Alexander Dowie died on this one day and then I was born the next. And he's literally talking about the passing of the Elijah mantle. And where Dowie was advertised as Elijah back in his era, William Branham is literally becoming the new Elijah, and he's forming this notion at the instruction of Bosworth. Bosworth is helping to create the next Elijah minister.
Right, and Bosworth and Lindsay, one or the other or both, share even some prophecies that Dowie had given about a new coming Elijah, and he incorporated their stories into his sermon when he went to Zion to claim to be Dowie's successor in different ways. So, it's very interesting, and Bosworth just plays a very important role as these healing revivals take off. And remember, this is 1 month before the Latter Rain revival kicks off that Bosworth starts touring with him. And as I mentioned before, Bosworth is the one who would warm up the crowds at the start of these revival meetings. He would probably preach more than William Branham did at these meetings that were being held. He would do the warm-up performance of the crowd. He'd preach about faith. He would share the teachings in his books. He would tell people what they needed to do to be prepared for divine healing. And he does this consistently and a lot all the way up into 1956 as this thing keeps getting bigger and bigger. And William Branham himself didn't do a whole lot of any sort of doctrinal preaching during this time at all. And really, Bosworth is the one who is shaping this movement's beliefs when it comes to divine healing, when it comes to word of faith, when it comes to positive confession. Bosworth is the main one shaping all of this, and William Branham is right there going along with it, and he, though, is the main draw. He's endorsing it, he's picking it up, he's sharing it, he's preaching it himself, and it really is something, how this grows. And Bosworth actually even wrote a chapter of William Branham's official biography, right? So Bosworth is very, very integral in many ways to what's going on here in the early days of the revival. And I think Bosworth, as you mentioned kind of at the beginning, is some of these elements of what we believe can go back to Roy Davis. A lot of elements of what we believed in the message also go on the religious side, go to Bosworth, right? He converts William Branham in some way over to some different ideas than what he had before.
It's so complex because in some aspects of what happened, in the years following, I see William Branham as sort of the mastermind of what was created. But it's complicated because at the same time he's a mastermind of some aspects of what happened, he's also this sponge who's absorbing things from Little David, who did the preaching before his Little David William Branham tours. David is replaced by Bosworth, and then Bosworth does most of the speaking. And we see that William Branham has absorbed these doctrines, and he goes forward with literally squeezing the sponge and just letting it spread throughout the revivals. And it's not just Little David and Bosworth, but we see him absorbing Charles Taze Russell, Dowie, Bosworth. I mean, the list of names goes on and on. Branham is this big sponge that's collecting notions from other cult leaders to form a later cult that would basically create all sorts of movements within American Christianity.
Right. And so while we don't have a lot of details about Bosworth's life, there's a lot of things missing that I would love to know. I would love to know more about his time in Zion. I would love to know what he was doing those missing 10 years. I would love to know, honestly, a little bit more about his healing revivals. There's a lot of stuff I'd like to know more about F.F. Bosworth about. And so I'm still kind of on the fence with Bosworth making any kind of a judgment on him or his ministry. And I think, personally, he might have been a nice guy with some misguided ideas and a man who had been intimidated by the Klan.
All right, that's enough of that. So he wasn't intimidated by the Klan. He was a part of the Klan back in the early 1900s at F.F. Bosworth. And he was a revivalist. Move forward to 1944 where Branham's taken over. Then after Branham, you got the Shambach, R.W. Shambachs, the A.A. Allens, the Oral Roberts, all these tent revivals and meetings. All these guys were charlatans. And I'm saying it. I'm not embracing it. This was about money because the Kardashians came in and financed all of this. The Kardashians, you got to be kidding me. And you watched it with Benny Hinn, how the people would flock around the Benny Hinn revivals, claiming they were healed. And they started doing 60-minute pieces on him, 2020, everything. Benny Hinn has disappeared because of all of the adultery, fornication, embezzlement, drug use of his security guards. The list goes on and on. Branham went to the guy, Dowie, who started this British Israelism stuff in Zion, Chicago, and was going to take over New York. These people believed in reincarnation, and we got some of these camps that are talking the same thing. They said the spirit of Elijah was coming upon them. That's why we have to be careful, because we got back in New York, escapes me right now. Well, Abba Bivens and different people like that who was saying the spirit of John is on me, the spirit of Elijah is going to be on you. I'm the comforter, I'm the Holy Spirit. One West camps speaking this type of doctrine like this. Bible says after the death comes the judgment. The mantle of Elijah was not passed from Dowie to Branham. We do know that Elijah and Enoch in the last days will come back and preach against the Antichrist in the tribulation, but that's not what this video is about. I just wanted you to hear the sensationalism, that sponge he talked about, how Branham produced Charles Taze Russell. That's the founder of Jehovah's Witness. Guess who else he produced? Jim Jones, People's Temple. The list goes on and on, people. And they all had their associations with the Ku Klux Klan, Freemasonry, and entertaining the people. Money always corrupts these people's minds. We know this is not the way, the truth of the light, that the way that they were going. Because look what the spawn was. Look at what the fruit was. I rest my case. I just wanted you to hear some of the history. I don't know if I'll do some of the other videos because this really kind of covered everything. The other videos just exposed some of the trickery, how they had a teenage boy preaching at the meetings and he would claim to levitate, and they found out that was fakery. We find out that Houdini started coming to the revival meetings to prove them to be at trickery. There was a lot of praying for people's legs to grow longer, and they would pull it and make it seem like the leg was growing longer. Look, I'm not one to blaspheme anything that the Most High does, but when you start doing showmanship and changing your doctrines and your theologies, do we serve A God that can heal, yes. But do you remember the Messiah saying, go tell nobody? Or he did it in secret? Or he put people out the room when he healed people? So these miracles have to be justified. When they started using mind control on people and telling them to speak the word of faith, they said positive confession must be used. Like, even if you start to feel the pain, don't confess it and accept it and embrace it. Keep confessing, I'm healed. I rebuke it, I'm healed. No, you're not. You're in pain. It's not good. The Most High doesn't do anything gradual. It's instantaneous. Bringing some exposure to the early Pentecostal church and these revival meetings of the early days, because you've got to remember how racist the time was, how separate the movements and the churches were, and what was, all of the stuff that was going on. The way, the truth, and the life is keeping the Most High's commandments. And he's only got one family that he knows on this earth that are made to be priests and teach you to keep the statutes, laws, and commandments. All right, shalom.